When one thinks of nuclear nations, the United Kingdom doesn't usually spring to mind, but Old Blighty has a long and impressive record of nuclear accomplishments dating back to the very origins of the field. British scientists like William Penney, Rudolf Peierls, and John Cockcroft were instrumental in kickstarting the Manhattan Project, while on October 3, 1952, Britain became the third nation after the United States and Soviet Union to build and test its own atomic bomb. Throughout the Cold War, squadrons of Royal Air Force V bombers stood ready to counter any Soviet attack, while today the Royal Navy's 4 Vanguard-class submarines, armed with up to 16 Trident II ballistic missiles each, prowl the world's oceans on vital deterrence patrols. And on October 10, 1957, decades before better-known disasters like 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima, the UK became the site of one of the nuclear age's first major accidents. On that day, a reactor at Cumbria accidentally caught fire, threatening to contaminate hundreds of square kilometres of English countryside with deadly radioactive fallout. This is the story of the Windscale Fire, the UK's forgotten nuclear disaster. The origins of the Windscale disaster can be traced back to one of the most fateful policy decisions of the Cold War. On August 1, 1946, US President Harry S. Truman signed the Atomic Energy Act, also known as the McMahon Act, into law. The act officially stripped control of nuclear technology from the military and handed it to a newly formed civilian agency, the Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC. But more significantly for international relations, it also declared all information on nuclear technology, no matter its origins, be restricted data and thus forbidden to be shared with any other nations, even close allies. Thus, despite their major contributions to the Manhattan Project, countries like the UK and Canada suddenly found themselves cut off from the vital nuclear data they had expected to enjoy in the post-war world. For the UK in particular, this diplomatic slight was more than a mere matter of national pride. It was only a matter of time before the Soviet Union developed an atomic bomb of its own, and the British Isles, being so close to Russia, were particularly vulnerable to attack. The British government, desperate to counter this looming threat, appealed repeatedly to the Americans for assistance with developing their own atomic bomb, but the AEC stubbornly clung to its secrets. Emerging from yet another fruitless round of negotiations in the fall of 1946, UK Foreign Minister Ernst Bevin declared, "We've got to have this thing over here, whatever it costs. We've got to have the bloody Union Jack flying on top of it. Our prestige in the world, as well as chances of securing American cooperation, would both suffer if we did not exploit to the full a discovery in which we had played a leading part at the outset." Cut off from outside assistance, the UK was forced to go it alone and develop its own atomic bomb from scratch. But it would not be easy. The Second World War had ravaged the nation both physically and economically, condemning the British people to a long period of post-war austerity. Indeed, it was not until 1954, nearly a decade after the war's end, that food rationing was finally ended. Worse still, at the time, UK politics was dominated by the Labour Party, many of whose members were avowed communists with strong ties to the Soviet Union. But the threat of Soviet aggression could not be ignored, and in January 1947, the cabinet of Prime Minister Clement Attlee approved the creation of a British nuclear program. Though this effort would be extremely expensive, Attlee hoped it would make the United States see Britain as an equal partner in the Cold War and help reforge the wartime special relationship between the two nations. In 1950, the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment, or AWRE, was established at RAF Aldermaston in Berkshire under the direction of mathematician and physicist William Penney, who during the war had led the British delegation to the Manhattan Project and helped choose Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the targets for the first atomic bombings. Working in parallel with AWRE was the Atomic Energy Research Establishment, or AERE, at Harwell, Nottinghamshire, under the direction of physicist John Cockcroft, who in February 1932 became the first person to split the atomic nucleus. Meanwhile, production of the vital uranium and plutonium needed to fuel an atomic bomb was overseen by the Deputy Controller of Production Atomic Energy, Christopher Hinton, who had directed the construction and operation of British armaments factories during the war. In 1954, all three groups were placed under the umbrella of the newly formed United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority, or UKAEA, chaired by Sir Edwin Plowden. In addition to limited funds, the British nuclear program faced another significant challenge. While British physicists knew the basics of atomic bomb design, none had been involved in the massive uranium and plutonium production efforts carried out at sites like Chicago, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, or Hanford, Washington. They were thus forced to improvise based on what little they managed to glean before the flow of American information was abruptly cut off. Thankfully, many of the contractors who had supplied materials to the Manhattan Project, including Union Carbide and the Electrometallurgical Company, had subsidiaries in the UK and Canada who were more than willing to share their expertise. During the Manhattan Project, plutonium was produced by bombarding natural uranium with neutrons in a nuclear reactor. When uranium-238 absorbs a neutron, it becomes the isotope U-239, which then decays twice via beta radiation to become neptunium-239 and finally plutonium-239. The first pilot-scale plutonium production reactor, codenamed X-10, was constructed at the Clinton Engineering Works at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, achieving criticality on November 4, 1943. Only the second nuclear reactor, ever built after Chicago Pile 1, which achieved the world's first self-sustained nuclear chain reaction on December 2, 1942, X-10 took the form of a giant cube, 7 meters to a side, constructed from blocks of pyrolytic graphite. This material acted as a moderator, slowing down neutrons to the speed required to sustain a chain reaction. This cube, or pile, was surrounded by a 2-meter-thick concrete radiation shield and pierced by 1,260 horizontal fuel channels arranged in a grid of 36 rows and 35 columns. Cylindrical slugs of natural uranium were fed into these channels from the face of the reactor and, when fully irradiated, pushed out the back. The irradiated slugs were then sent to a chemical processing plant where the plutonium was extracted and purified. Running vertically through the pile were channels for 7 neutron-absorbing cadmium or boron steel control rods, which could be inserted or withdrawn from the core to control the rate of the reaction. Finally, the reactor was cooled using 3 massive electric blowers capable of displacing 1,600 cubic meters of air. Once the basic principles of plutonium production were refined using X-10, construction of a much larger production model known as the B reactor began at Hanford site in Washington state. First achieving criticality in September 1944, B reactor was similar in design to X-10 but nearly twice as large, measuring at 12 meters to a side and featuring 2004 fuel channels. Unlike X-10, B reactor was water-cooled, drawing coolant directly from the Columbia River. After passing through the reactor, this water was discharged into settling basins, allowing the temperature to drop and short-lived radioactive fission products to decay away before being drained back into the river. Between 1944 and its decommissioning in 1968, the B reactor at Hanford produced 67.4 metric tons of plutonium, including the material used in the Trinity gadget, the world's first atomic bomb detonated on July 16, 1945, and the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th. For the site of the British plutonium reactors, Christopher Hinton chose the former seaside resort of Seascale in Cumbria, northwest England, site of a major wartime munitions plant. The reactors, dubbed Windscale, were heavily based on the American X-10 and B reactors, though several shortcuts were taken to reduce costs and construction time. For example, while the water cooling used at Hanford was more efficient and allowed the reactor to operate at higher power levels, this required access to huge volumes of water and introduced the significant risk of steam explosions, requiring such reactors to be sited far away from major population centers. Unfortunately, as the United Kingdom is a bit smaller and more densely populated than the US, this condition could not be easily met. Some thought was given to building the reactors in Canada, but this proposal was swiftly rejected as the UK government was unwilling to place its nuclear production facilities under Canadian jurisdiction. Furthermore, the UK lacked many large sources of high-purity water, without which the magnesium and aluminium cladding on the uranium fuel cartridges would quickly corrode. Getting around this problem required building large water purification facilities, which would not only be expensive and potentially delay the entire project by years, but also greatly increase the risk of a reactor loss of coolant accidents. It was thus decided to build an air-cooled reactor like X-10. Such a design would not only be safer, it was believed, but also cheaper and quicker to build. Indeed, the original government mandate called for a single reactor costing around £20 million, capable of producing plutonium for around 15 bombs every year. Once the air-cooled design was adopted, however, the government approved the construction of 2 reactors at a cost of £30 to £35 million. Construction at Windscale began in September 1947. Some 5,000 scientists, technicians, construction workers, and other personnel flooded into the sleepy seaside town of Seascale, requiring considerable amounts of new housing to be constructed. Seascale soon developed a national reputation as the most educated town in the UK, with some of its brightest students, so much so that the town struggled to find science teachers up to the task. The national media, keen to trumpet Britain's bold entry into the atomic age, reported daily on the achievements of the heroic atom men at Windscale, elevating some to the status of minor celebrities. The 2 plutonium reactors at Windscale, creatively dubbed Pile 1 and Pile 2, comprised graphite cylinders 7.6 meters across and 15.2 meters deep, pierced by 3,440 fuel channels. Each channel could hold up to 21 fuel cartridges for a total of 72,240 cartridges in a full load. The fuel cartridges themselves valves comprised double-walled aluminium and magnesium alloy cylinders containing natural uranium and featuring radial fins past which cooling air could blow. This air, supplied by 8 primary and 2 auxiliary blowers, traveled horizontally through the reactor from front to back before exiting a 120-meter-tall vertical cooling tower. As in the X-10 and B reactors, fuel cartridges were fed into the face of the reactor and pushed out the rear, with irradiated elements falling into a trough of cooling water where they were collected for processing at a nearby chemical plant in Springfield. Finally, control of the reactor was achieved via 24 vertical boron steel control rods, which could be hydraulically inserted and withdrawn from the reactor. There were also 16 fail-safe rods suspended above the reactor via electromagnets, such that in the event of a power failure, they would automatically drop into the core and shut down or scram the chain reaction. Construction of the Windscale Fire was beset by constant difficulties, largely resulting from its builders working with incomplete information. While the United States was unwilling to share cutting-edge nuclear research, it did not leave the UK completely in the dark. After all, a major nuclear disaster in the UK could potentially discredit the United States and its allies on the world stage. Teams of American physicists and engineers thus frequently visited Windscale and other British nuclear installations to consult on various technical matters. Unfortunately, this arrangement resulted in vital information being delivered piecemeal, often when construction was already well underway. Among the most important revelations involved the so-called Wigner effect, named after American physicist Eugene Wigner. This was a buildup of energy inside the moderator blocks, resulting from the dislocation of the graphite's crystal structure by high-energy neutrons. This could cause the graphite to expand over time, requiring gaps to be left between the blocks to compensate. Thankfully, the natural graphite used in British reactors was less prone to expansion than the synthetic graphite favored by the Americans, so this turned out to be just a minor problem. However, if Wigner energy was allowed to build up inside the core, it could suddenly be released as a burst of heat, potentially igniting the graphite and setting off a catastrophic fire. The Americans thus instructed the British to periodically anneal the core, raising the core temperature to allow the Wigner energy to dissipate slowly. Another potential hazard was discovered by John Cockcroft, head of the Atomic Energy Research Establishment, while visiting the X-10 reactor at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The reactor, his American hosts revealed, suffered from what they called bad breath. The fuel elements had a nasty tendency to overheat and split open, releasing radioactive particles into the atmosphere. The American engineers were thus forced to fit the cooling tower on the X-10 with a sophisticated filter to trap these particles. On returning to the UK, Cockcroft discovered to his horror that the Windscale Fire suffered from the same problem. If the fuel cartridges were pushed too forcefully from the charge face, they could overshoot the cooling trough entirely and land in the air duct beyond, splitting open and releasing radiation up the stacks. Cockcroft thus insisted that similar filters to those on X-10 be fitted to the Windscale piles. But there was a problem. The 120-meter cooling towers had already been completed, meaning the filters would have to be installed on top of them. Though many in the atomic program opposed the idea, dismissing it as costly and unnecessary, Cockcroft, an influential figure who would be awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1951 for his work in splitting the atom, ultimately got his way, and a pair of 200-ton steel and brick filter units, derisively nicknamed Cockcroft's Follies, were installed atop the cooling towers. The unusual profile of the Windscale towers quickly became emblematic of nuclear power in the UK, much as the hyperboloidal cooling towers are in the United States and elsewhere. And despite the resistance and dismissal faced by Cockcroft, his insistence on installing the filters would prove far-sighted, preventing the disaster that was about to unfold from becoming even worse. Despite these difficulties, construction at Windscale carried on at a breakneck pace. The project made all the more urgent by recent events. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, RDS-1, at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan, years ahead of Western analysts' predictions. The American nuclear monopoly, barely 4 years old, was shattered. Under Christopher Hinton's merciless direction, Windscale was completed only a few weeks behind schedule, with Pile No. 1 achieving first criticality in October 1950 and Pile No. 2 in June 1951. Plutonium production began in March 1952, and by autumn of that year, enough had been produced to build a bomb. The first British nuclear test, codenamed Operation Hurricane, took place at 11:59 local time on October 2, 1952, in the Montebello Islands off the northwest coast of Australia. Unusually, the Hurricane device was detonated in the hull of the Royal Navy River-class frigate HMS Plym to simulate the effects of a ship-smuggled weapon, a great concern to the British authorities at the time. The weapon, whose yield was measured at 25 kilotons of TNT, blasted a 300-meter wide, 6-meter deep crater in the ocean floor and threw up an unusual mud-laden cauliflower cloud. The United Kingdom had entered the nuclear club, only the third nation in history to do so. Between 1953 and 1957, the British would conduct a further 11 nuclear tests in the Montebellos, as well as at Emu Field and Maralinga in South Australia, before the Australian government banned testing on its territory and operations moved to Malden and Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean. For his role in getting the Windscale Fire built on schedule, in 1956, Christopher Hinton was created Baron Hinton of Bankside by Queen Elizabeth II. But the British could not afford to rest on their laurels, for on November 1st, 1952, just a month after Operation Hurricane, the United States detonated Ivy Mike, the world's first thermonuclear weapon, or hydrogen bomb. By fusing hydrogen into helium, thermonuclear weapons could attain yields measuring in megatons of TNT, allowing entire cities to be wiped out in the blink of an eye. Less than 2 years later, on March 1, 1954, the US detonated Castle Bravo, the first practical hydrogen bomb capable of being delivered by aircraft, while the Soviets followed suit on November 22, 1955, by testing their first hydrogen bomb, RDS-37. The Cold War, and human history itself, had entered a dangerous new phase, and to learn more about these apocalyptic weapons and the men who created them, please do check out our previous video, Who Invented the Hydrogen Bomb? In the wake of Castle Bravo and RDS-37, the British threw themselves into developing their own hydrogen bomb. The two pals at Windscale were soon working overtime, producing plutonium for these and other weapons. On May 15, 1957, the British detonated their first prototype hydrogen bomb, codenamed Grapple-1, over Malden Island. The test was a failure, the fusion secondary failing to ignite and the device producing a yield of only 300 kilotons. Scrambling to get any type of high-yield weapon into production, the British turned to a boosted fission weapon codenamed Orange Herald, in which radioactive tritium gas, a heavy isotope of hydrogen, was injected into the plutonium core just prior to detonation. And to learn more about the fascinating history behind British weapons names, please do check out our previous video, Death by Blue Peacock, Britain's Bizarre and Deadly Cold War Rainbow Codes. This tritium was also produced at Windscale by irradiating special fuel cartridges filled with lithium. The first prototype Orange Herald device, codenamed Grapple-2, was detonated over Malden Island on May 31, 1957, producing a yield of 720 kilotons. This was followed on June 19th by Grapple-3, an improved version of the Grapple-1 thermonuclear device. But this too was a failure, producing a yield of only 200 kilotons. The pressure on the British nuclear program grew even more intense when on October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite. Though the basketball-sized satellite did little more than transmit a series of radio beeps, the message was clear: if the Soviets could launch a satellite into orbit, it could also lob a nuclear warhead across oceans and continents, striking any target on Earth with little warning. Rattled by this development, on October 10th, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan wrote to US President Dwight D. Eisenhower, urging him to re-establish its nuclear partnership with the UK. Quote, "This artificial satellite has brought it home to us what formidable people they are and what a menace they present to the free world. Their resources and knowledge and their system of government will enable them to keep up the pressure for a very long time to come, perhaps 2 or 3 generations. After that, we must hope that the communist ideology will be spent and that their people will revert gradually to ordinary human behavior. Is the free world really equipped to meet this challenge? When we were all rich, we could all afford, for reasons of prestige and all sorts of other reasons, to go our own ways and to try and be self-sufficient. But none of us can now afford the waste of effort and duplication that this involves. The Russian challenge is on every front: military, political, economic, and ideological. The free world has tremendous resources to meet this challenge if it acts together, but these resources must not be dissipated. Has not the time come when we could go further towards pooling our efforts and decide how best to use them for our common good? One example of this pooling of resources springs obviously to mind. It is, of course, in such things as nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, anti-missile defenses, and anti-submarine weapons." End quote. Macmillan's timing could not have been worse, for on that very day, Britain experienced the worst nuclear disaster in its history. From the moment they were switched on, the reactors at Windscale had given their operators nothing but trouble. In early May 1952, less than a year after first achieving criticality, the temperature of pile number 2 began to rise unexpectedly. The operators managed to halt the spike by increasing airflow through the cooling fans, but the cause of the incident could not be determined. Later that month, when the reactor was shut down for maintenance, operators discovered to their shock that several fuel elements had been blown out of their channels by the cooling fans and lay scattered about behind the reactor. One element had even split open, allowing radioactive particles to escape up the cooling tower. In September of that year, the temperature of pile number 1 also began to rise unexpectedly. While this spike was also successfully halted by turning up the cooling fans, the reactor had come dangerously close to catching fire. Shortly thereafter, the Cockcroft's Follies filters were found to be malfunctioning, meaning large amounts of radiation had inadvertently been allowed to escape into the surrounding environment. Indeed, in the summer of 1957, a routine radiological survey revealed that the level of radioactive strontium-90 in milk had risen to nearly 2/3 the level permitted for consumption by infants. However, Prime Minister Macmillan ordered these findings kept secret so as to not impede the nuclear program or tarnish British national prestige. By this time, British nuclear technology had advanced far beyond the primitive Windscale piles. On October 17, 1956, Queen Elizabeth II officially opens the Calder Hall nuclear power station at the Seascale site, the world's first large-scale commercial nuclear power plant. Designed to produce both electrical power for the UK grid and plutonium for the nuclear weapons program, Calder Hall featured 4 state-of-the-art 60-megawatt graphite-moderated carbon dioxide-cooled Magnox reactors. The design proved extremely reliable, the plant remaining in operation for 47 years before finally being decommissioned in 2003. Indeed, while Christopher Hinton, who left Windscale in August 1957 to chair the Central Electric Generating Board, stated that, quote, "Windscale has always been my pride and joy, a real great factory, thoroughly well managed." He also dismissed the reactors as monuments to our initial ignorance, admitting that the design was chosen purely out of expedience and advising that no new reactors be built on this model. However, so urgent was the demand for plutonium and tritium that the 2 Windscale piles were kept running day and night, while various questionable measures were implemented to increase their output. For instance, just prior to Pile 1's activation in 1950, the builders realized that the aluminium and magnesium cladding and fins on the fuel cartridges absorbed too many neutrons, reducing the reactivity of the pile. Workers thus spent 3 weeks feverishly shaving 4 millimeters off the fins of 700,000 cartridges to get the reactor up and running on schedule. In 1957, the cartridges were completely redesigned to produce the Mark III, which featured shorter cooling fins and a larger internal diameter, allowing more uranium to be loaded per cartridge. However, the design also dispensed with the outer aluminium canister, greatly increasing the risk of cartridges splitting and releasing radiation. And while annealing cycles to dissipate Wigner energy were originally conducted every 30,000 megawatt days of operation, this was increased to 40,000 megawatt days to reduce downtime. Such productivity shortcuts alarmed the plant's safety staff and ultimately led Christopher Hinton to resign in frustration. At 11:45 on October 7, 1957, the operating staff, under the direction of reactor physicist Ian Robinson, began the annealing process on Windscale Pile No. 1. This was the reactor's 9th annealing since first achieving criticality, but the first to be conducted after 40,000 rather than 30,000 megawatt days. However, this energy had been released during the last anneal in July, meaning the reactor had accumulated some 70,000 megawatt days worth of Wigner energy. An anneal was long overdue. The process called for all the control rods to be withdrawn at once to raise the temperature of the entire core, then individual rods withdrawn one at a time to further heat the lower core, where most of the Wigner energy was known to accumulate. Robertson remained with his team through the night until the early morning of October the 8th, before returning home. Like many Britons, he was suffering from the Asia flu, then running rampant around the world. After resting for a few hours at 9 a.m, Robertson was back in control of the room, where he received some bad news. Hardly any energy had been released during the anneal, meaning the whole process had to be repeated. The controllers duly withdrew the control rods to start heating up the core. Almost immediately, things started to go wrong. As the core reached its target temperature of 330 degrees Celsius, certain areas suddenly jumped to 380 degrees. While the controllers managed to bring the temperature back down by turning up the cooling fans, the reactor's response was sluggish and erratic, making it difficult to keep under control. As American nuclear engineer James Mahaffey later wrote, quote, "Driving it was like trying to steer RMS Titanic around an iceberg." At 10 p.m. on October the 9th and midnight on October the 10th, the core temperatures spiked again, with one thermocouple returning a reading of over 770 degrees. But no matter how much cooling air the operators blew into the reactor, the temperature simply refused to fall. And later that morning, a sharp rise in radiation was detected in the cooling tower, indicating a burst fuel cartridge. At 2 p.m, this release was confirmed by a routine radiation check 1 kilometer from the plant, prompting Hugh Howells, Windscale's health and safety manager, to sound the alarm. He contacted Tom Hughes, assistant works manager, who then contacted Ron Galston, the pile manager. To both men's shock, Galston had known the whole time about the trouble with pile number 1, but had chosen to keep the situation to himself, believing that management would be unable to offer any useful advice. Together with Henry Davey, the chief works manager, Howells, Hughes, Gaursden and Robertson set about trying to locate the burst cartridge. Unfortunately, the core was too hot for the automatic burst cartridge detection gear to function, so instrument technician Arthur Wilson was sent in to investigate. But there was another problem. Quote, on the Thursday morning, there was no way of knowing the temperature as some of the thermocouples had burnt off. We'd tried attaching new ones, but they burnt off too. So, Wilson decided to take a more direct approach and simply look inside the reactor, later recalling, I opened the gag port, and there it was. There was a fire at the face of the reactor. I can't say I thought a lot about it at the time. There was so much to do. I didn't think, hurrah, I found it. I rather thought, oh dear, now we are in a pickle. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the British understatement of the millennium. Opening more observation ports, Wilson's colleagues confirmed his observations. A huge section of the graphite lattice was glowing red hot. Ron Gaursden immediately ordered workers to use long bamboo poles to push all the fuel cartridges out of the back of the reactor into the cooling trough. However, most of the cartridges in the burning area had been damaged by the heat and were stuck fast in their channels. Gaursden therefore instructed the workers to push out the loose cartridges around the fire, hoping to create a fire break and prevent the conflagration from spreading. It was hellish work, with only rudimentary safety clothing and the flows of cooling air at their backs protecting the 8 workers at the reactor face from the extreme heat and radiation. But while he had been instrumental in identifying the problem, Arthur Wilson was not among them, having been sent home by management, as he later recalled, it's the other poor souls I feel most sorry for, the ones who had to go in and sort out the mess. Meanwhile, Chief Works Manager Henry Davey, also ill with the flu, called up Deputy General Manager Tom Toohey, then at home tending to his sick wife and kids. While Davey went home to rest, Toohey rushed to pile number 1 to assess the situation. After donning some 16 kilos of protective clothing and breathing equipment, Toohey scaled a 24-meter-high ladder to the roof and opened an observation port, looking down into the rear face of the reactor. And what he saw terrified him. To quote, first, there was a red glow as the fire was spreading down the channel. Then there were flames coming out the back. Then there were massive flames shooting right across the discharge duct and impinging on the concrete wall at the back of the duct. End quote. By this time, the fire had grown to envelop 150 channels, and the core temperature was rising fast, the color of the flames shooting out the back of the reactor changing from red to yellow to blue. Toohey also had 2 immediate concerns. First, structural engineers had warned that the roof of the concrete biological shield around the reactor would collapse if exposed to temperatures above 600 degrees, and second, if the core reached 1200 degrees, all the trapped Wigner energy could be released at once, setting the whole reactor ablaze and releasing hundreds of kilograms of vaporized uranium, plutonium, and other radionucleotides into the atmosphere. Frustratingly, Toohey had few tools at his disposal with which to fight the fire. As he later explained, one of our troubles was the only coolant we had at this stage was air, and air and fire are not very good companions. If you supply no coolant at all to the surrounding graphite and the still Wigner energy, you could have a much bigger fire on your hands. He thus decided to resume Gadsden's plan of pushing as many fuel canisters as possible out of the core. As the original bamboo poles proved woefully inadequate for this task, workers gathered up whatever metal rods they could find around, including sections of scaffolding from a nearby construction site. By this time, the core temperature was so high that many of the cartridges the workers extracted from the core were dripping with molten aluminium and uranium. As one worker later recalled, quote, if the exposed fuel channel was white hot, it was just white hot. Nobody can believe how hot it could possibly be. Concerned about radiation exposure, Toohey ordered his men to work in shifts and had reinforcements brought in to fill the ranks, with many being pulled straight out of a local cinema. Yet despite hours of heroic work, the effort was a failure. Too many cartridges were hopelessly stuck in the core. Toohey thus decided to switch tactics and attack the fire with liquid carbon dioxide used as the primary coolant in the nearby Calder Hall Magnox reactor. Feeding in the gas proved an unexpected challenge. The only path to the charge lift on the reactor face was through the access elevator, but when hoses were run into the cab, they prevented the door from closing and the elevator from rising. Eventually, the workers managed to pass the hoses through the cab roof and the emergency escape ladder in the elevator shaft. Quote, I had some men pull a plug out of the wall and put this tube in, spanning the gap, which wasn't just glowing red hot, it was flaming all over the place. But by 4 a.m. on October the 11th, all was ready and Toohey ordered the valves opened. Over the next hour, 25 tons of liquid CO2 were piped into the reactor. Meanwhile, Toohey climbed back to the roof to observe the rear face of the reactor, absorbing large amounts of radiation in the process. Indeed, after turning in his original dosimeter badge, which recorded his accumulated radiation dose, he refused to wear another, lest he be sent home by health and safety. As Toy later recalled, exposing myself was a rather unhealthy thing to do, but there was no other way of finding out what was going to happen except to look at the channels. Nothing happened. It just went on burning merrily as before. With the fire still raging out of control, Tui was left with only one option, one which he had desperately hoped to avoid: try and put out the fire with water. This was an incredibly risky move. Not only would the water damage the core beyond repair, but on contact with the red-hot graphite, aluminium, magnesium, and uranium, it would generate large quantities of hydrogen and carbon monoxide gas, which could potentially build up above the reactor and explode, blowing the already weak roof off the building. But Tui had no choice. By now, some 11 tons of uranium and graphite were burning, pushing the core temperature to around 3,100 Celsius. The biological shield was on the verge of collapsing. He thus ordered the firemen to inject the water into the cooler upper fuel channels and let it slowly seep down through the gaps between the graphite blocks, slowly cooling the whole core while minimizing steam and gas production. It took 2 hours to get 12 hoses hooked up to the reactor and fire trucks, and another 2 to brief the incoming shift of workers. But by 9 a.m, everything was ready. Quote, I asked for 30 pounds of pressure on the water supply and sat down at the entrance to the service lift as near to the charge hoist as I reasonably could, listening for any horrible noises. When nothing happened, Toy ordered the pressure raised to 60, then 120 psi, then climbed once more to the roof to inspect the fire. To his dismay, he saw water gushing out of the upper fuel chambers directly into the fuel receiving trough below. He ordered the pressure lowered, and while the water soon began trickling down through the pile as intended, the fire continued to blaze away unabated. Toy had played his last available hand, and it had failed. But then Toy had a revelation. With water being pumped into the core, the cooling air from the blowers was no longer necessary. Cutting it off might starve the fire of vital oxygen and finally turn the tide. Toy ordered the fans shut off, and by now, utterly exhausted, slogged back up to the roof. This time, the effect was instantaneous. Quote, I had one hell of a job to level the discs off the inspection holes at the back. The fire, now not being fed with air, was trying to get air from wherever it could. I have no doubt it was even sucking air in through the chimney at this point to try and maintain itself. It was dramatic. I could see the fire dying out. First the flames went, then the flames reduced, and the glow began to die down. I went up to check several times until I was satisfied that the fire was out. I did stand to one side, sort of hopefully. You've got this blazing inferno with these flames belting out to know that you've licked it. That was a marvellous feeling. End quote. By noon on October the 11th, 1957, the fire in Windscale Pile No. 1 had finally been extinguished. But as the core had already been ruined beyond repair, Tui kept the water flowing for another 24 hours just to be sure. One concern was that the reaction between the water and uranium had produced large quantities of uranium hydride, which could spontaneously ignite on contact with the air. While Tui and his team were fighting to get the blaze at Pile No. 1 under control, news of the disaster was only just starting to make its way to the authorities, who until this point had been completely unaware that anything was wrong with the reactor. As instrument technician Arthur Wilson later recalled, quote, the reaction of the management to the news that there was a fire was, don't be so bloody daft. I don't know what they expected. For days, it had been going wrong. End quote. Indeed, it was not until midnight on October the 11th, a full 3 days after the trouble with Pile No. 1 had begun, that K.B. Ross, director of the Atomic Energy Authority's industrial group, learned of the ongoing disaster, and not until 8 a.m. that Ross sent a memo to Sir Edward Plowden, chairman of the AEA, tersely informing him that, quote, Windscale Pile No. 1 found to be on fire in middle of lattice at 4:30 p.m. yesterday during Wigner release. Position been held all night, but fire still fierce. Emission has not been very serious and hope to continue to hold this. Are now ejecting water above fire and are watching results. Do not require help at present. End quote. According to nuclear historian Lorna Arnold, this sluggish response and reluctance to ask for outside help was a direct result of, quote, Windscale's tradition of proud independence and rugged self-help. Windscale, a unique and isolated site, had developed a powerful corporate loyalty and pride reminiscent of the local patriotism that Italians call campanilismo. But once news finally reached the proper authorities, the emergency response was swift. Local police constables were apprised of the situation and allowed to set up emergency headquarters at the Windscale site. 3,000 construction workers and hundreds of local schoolchildren were sent home and instructed to stay indoors, while teams of personnel were dispatched up and down the coast with Geiger counters to monitor radiation levels. Finally, buses and train cars were assembled in the nearby town of Whitehaven in case of evacuation. Yet despite the authorities' best efforts, not everyone was adequately informed about the disaster. As the West Cumberland News reported on October the 12th, rumours of a fire in one of the piles at Windscale Works atomic energy factory swept through West Cumberland yesterday morning, 200 yards from Pile 1, saw septuagenarian Mrs. Stanley, whose family had been lords of the manor for over 600 years, calmly planting out wallflowers in the garden in front of her cottage. If asked if she was at all worried about what was happening at the atomic factory, she replied, "No, why should I be? If there was anything to worry about, they would have told me by now. In any case, my family have been here for over 600 years, and I'm staying here." The national press itself only learned of the accident after a local newspaper editor noticed personnel from Windscale testing people's clothing with Geiger counters and contacted his colleagues at the BBC and Associated Press. Reporters soon began descending on C-scale, presenting the Atomic Energy Authority with a potential public relations disaster. Meanwhile, Hugh Howells, Windscale's health and safety manager, struggled to gauge the extent of radioactive contamination in the surrounding countryside and prevented entering the food chain. Of particular concern was radioisotopes like strontium-90 and iodine-131 making their way into the local milk supply via cows feeding on contaminated grass. However, at the time, no official exposure limits for those isotopes existed, and it was not until October the 12th that Howells and his team established a threshold of 0.1 microcuries per litre of milk. By this time, iodine-131 levels in Cumbria milk had reached 0.8 microcuries per litre, so on October the 14th, Howells ordered all milk and vegetables within a 30 by 13 kilometre area around Windscale destroyed. This effort was coordinated with the assistance of the Milk Marketing Board, which compensated local farmers for their losses to the tune of £60,000. For several years following the Windscale fire, many local residents switched to drinking powdered milk out of fear of radioactive contamination. British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan finally responded to the crisis on October the 13th, asking Sir Edward Plowden whether an official inquiry would be held. Plowden confirmed the Board of Inquiry would be convened, chaired by Sir Leonard Owen, director of the AEA's industrial group. However, 2 days later, Plowden announced to the media that the board would instead be headed by Chief Superintendent of Armaments Research William Penney. In making this decision, Plowden was performing a delicate political balancing act. While entrusting the inquiry to the industrial group would have been a conflict of interest, the UK government could not afford a completely independent investigation that might potentially embarrass and undermine the British nuclear industry. Consequently, this investigation was taken away from the industrial group while remaining under the auspices of the AEA. At the time, William Penney was preoccupied with preparations for another hydrogen bomb test, Grapple X, set to take place the following month at Christmas Island. He thus gave the Board of Inquiry only 5 days to conduct the investigation and prepare their final report. The report, completed on October the 22nd, blames the fire on the second annealing operation, as well as the design of the new Mark III fuel cartridges, which were extremely prone to splitting at temperatures above 427 degrees Celsius. Indeed, in testing, all prototypes had failed within a few hours when heated above 450. In addition to design changes to future reactors, the report also recommended a reorganization of the management structure at Windscale, arguing that too few people had been assigned too many responsibilities. However, it also heaped praise on the managers and workers responsible for putting out the fire, noting that, quote, "The steps taken to deal with the accident, once it was discovered, were prompt and efficient and displayed considerable devotion to duty on the part of all concerned." The report was immediately dispatched to Prime Minister Macmillan, who on October the 29th wrote to Sir Edward Plowden, stating with even more typical British understatement that, quote, "I've read all this. It is fascinating. The problem is twofold. A, what do we do? Not very difficult. And B, what do we say? Not easy." Macmillan was in a difficult position, having just returned from a triumphant meeting with US President Eisenhower, in which the latter agreed to push for an amendment to the 1946 Atomic Energy Act, restoring America and Britain's special relationship and the flow of nuclear information between the two nations. But such an agreement required the approval of Congress, and a damning indictment of the British nuclear industry could easily derail the whole process. So, Macmillan ordered all copies of Penney's report recalled and destroyed, instead issuing a heavily edited white paper stating, "In a memorandum which the chairman of the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority has submitted to me regarding the accident, the authority state that the accident was due partly to inadequacies under the instrumentation provided at Windscale for the maintenance operation that was being performed at the time of the accident, and partly to faults of judgment by the operating staff, these faults in judgment being themselves attributable to a weakness of organisation." This assessment angered the staff at Windscale, who had fought bravely to get the fire under control and expected to be lauded, not blamed by the government. As Dr. J.V. Dunworth stated, quote, "Absolutely disgraceful, blaming junior people who had no means of defending themselves." But by this time, media attention had turned away from Windscale, for at 8:47 a.m. local time on November 8, 1957, William Penney successfully detonated Grapple X, Britain's first successful thermonuclear weapon over Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean. The device, dropped from a Vickers Valiant bomber and detonated at an altitude of 2,250 meters to minimize fallout, exhibited a yield of 1.8 megatons, nearly twice as powerful as planned. Britain had entered the thermonuclear age, and William Penney returned home a hero. Britain would conduct 5 more thermonuclear tests at Christmas Island between April and September 1958, after which the British nuclear program switched to underground nuclear testing at the Nevada test site in the United States. Indeed, shortly before the end of Operation Grapple, Prime Minister Macmillan finally clinched his great prize when, on July 3, 1958, the US-UK Mutual Defence Agreement was signed in Washington, D.C. The agreement not only permitted the two nations to share research, but also allowed Britain to purchase American nuclear technology, including highly enriched uranium fuel, nuclear propulsion plants for submarines, and Polaris and Trident submarine-launched ballistic missiles. This partnership would persist through the rest of the Cold War, and indeed to the present day. Meanwhile, in the wake of the 1957 fire, the 2 piles at Windscale were permanently shut down. As is typical with nuclear power plants, the subsequent decommissioning process was long and arduous, with the last uranium fuel not being removed from the facility until 1999, and demolition of the containment building not taking place until 2019. From start to finish, the decommissioning is estimated to have cost nearly £2 billion. The human and environmental cost of the Windscale fire, however, is more difficult to determine. In many ways, the residents of Cumbria and the UK as a whole were extremely lucky, as the disaster could easily have been much, much worse. John Cockcroft's foresight and stubbornness paid off, for his unpopular filters helped trap up to 95% of the radionucleotides released from the core. As physicist Terence Price later noted, the word folly did not seem appropriate after the accident. But the filters couldn't trap everything, and an estimated 12 kilograms of uranium was released into the environment between 1954 and 1957, along with 324,000 curies of xenon-135, 20,000 curies of iodine-131, and 594 curies of cesium-137. Thankfully, prevailing winds blew most of this material west out into the Irish Sea, but at high altitudes easterly, the winds blew in the opposite direction and carried the fallout eastward over northern England and across the North Sea to mainland Europe. In the wake of the disaster, sampling around Windscale revealed levels of iodine-131 in children's thyroid glands 3 times higher than normal, and levels of strontium-90 in milk and other foodstuffs 2 to 5 times higher than the national average. But the effects of radiation exposure are complex, vary widely from person to person, and are difficult to disentangle from those of other environmental factors. So while some studies have determined that rates of leukemia and lymphoma around Windscale are 14 times higher than the national average, these findings have been disputed. In 1982, a report by the British National Radiological Protection Board could only directly attribute 32 deaths and 260 cancers, 100 fatal, to the 1957 accident. As for the brave Windscale workers who fought for days to bring the reactor fire under control, at least 14 received radiation doses exceeding 3 Rontgen. And to learn more about the surprisingly complex way radiation exposure is measured, please do check out our previous video, How Much Radiation Can the Human Body Take? Yet, once again, the effects of this exposure have been extremely varied. For instance, Deputy General Manager Tom Toohey, who likely received the highest dose of anyone at the site, lived to the ripe old age of 91, stating in an interview that it just shows you can have a lot more radiation than is being said without it having any real adverse effect. I am walking proof. A pretty good physical specimen to be in my 72nd year, radiation or no radiation. There is absolutely no justification for the fuss being made about leukemias or anything else. Indeed, while the health of the Windscale workers was monitored over a 50-year period, they were found more likely to die of heart disease than the overall population of England and Wales. However, this probably shrank significantly when compared to the area immediately surrounding Windscale, and dropped to nearly zero when workers involved in fighting the fire were compared to those who were not. And while environmental surveys have found elevated levels of various radionucleotides in local sea life like mussels, the long-term impacts of this contamination are yet to be determined. The 1957 Windscale fire is currently ranked 5 out of 7 on the International Atomic Energy Agency's International Nuclear and Radiological Event Scale, on par with the 1979 Three Mile Island incident and just behind the 1986 Chernobyl and 2011 Fukushima disaster. Windscale was far from history's first large-scale nuclear disaster, that dubious honour belonging either to March 1st, 1954 Castle Bravo hydrogen bomb test, or the September 29th, 1957 Kistein disaster, in which a Soviet radioactive waste storage tank exploded and spread contamination across vast swaths of the Ural Mountains. And to learn more about this other forgotten mishap, please do check out our previous video, The Secret Chernobyl Before Chernobyl. It was, however, the first major public incident involving a nuclear reactor, one which dramatically revealed the reckless shortcuts the British government had taken in pursuit of the atomic bomb, and began to expose cracks in the bright, optimistic facade of the atomic age.